The overall results of the survey show that bookkeepers and accountants are not rushing to embrace the digital world of learning, except in the area of webinars, which now surprisingly are a stepstone from classroom to digital learning. CPA Canada did a survey in 2012 and asked the same question, and the results were 180% in variance from what I discovered. In other words, in 2012, there was a high percentage that wanted what we call bumps and seats learning.
You're listening to The Successful Bookkeeper with your host, Michael Palmer. Listen each week as inspiring guests share their secrets of success to help you increase your confidence, work smarter, and build a business you love. This episode of The Successful Bookkeeper is brought to you by PureBookkeeping.com, the proven system to grow your bookkeeping business.
Welcome back to the Successful Bookkeeper Podcast. I am your host, Michael Palmer, and today we have a guest returning to this highly anticipated show. Alan Salmon has over 27 years of business, management experience, education, and journalism experience. As the managing director of K2E, he is responsible for the Canadian operations of this international consulting group, which provides professional development and technology education for accountants across Canada and the United States, as well globally. And now he's back, and it's a really interesting topic today. Alan, thank you for coming back.
My pleasure, Michael. I'm always glad to talk with you.
Yeah. And so for those who haven't had a chance to listen to the episode that you were previously on, can you share a bit of your background to give our listeners a little understanding of who you are more than what I just shared?
Certainly, and let's focus on the bookkeeping community. I've been involved with bookkeepers for most of those 27 years, most of the time teaching seminars on technology topics. For example, there's an interesting discussion going on right now. I asked the folks on a number of Facebook groups to find out if anybody had any pictures of the original accounting program in Canada, which was Bedford Accounting. And that's generated some amazing experience, and I remember that well back in 1985, would you believe? So from there, for the last 5 years, my focus in the bookkeeping world has been on the Institute of Professional Bookkeepers of Canada. I served as an advisor for 8 years, and for the last 4 years, I've been on the board. And it's been really exciting working with the bookkeepers on IPBC. They're a dedicated group. The board is amazing, and they produce some amazing paybacks for bookkeepers in Canada. Their CPB designation is now recognized as the gold standard.
That it is. That's great, Alan, and it's a wonderful organization. And I know in our previous conversations, we've had the founders of IPBC, or some of the founders of IPBC on, as well as their former CEO. And we heavily recommend that every listener listening belong to some form of an association for the industry. It's such a powerful experience to go and be around other people that are committed to their own success. So again, we echo that again, and I think every episode, but wherever you are in the world, if you're in Canada, the gold standard really is the IPBC, the Institute of Professional Bookkeepers. So if you're not belonging to that, you don't know about it, please go check it out. There will be links in the show notes. But as well, there's other ones in every country. There's going to be an association that you can belong to. And I think it's a great segue into what we're talking about today, which is you've done a lot of research on how bookkeepers and accountants learn. And you've done extensive research on this, and you've written a paper on it. And that was the purpose to have you back, is to talk about what this means to us, what you found out, and how our listeners can take advantage of your learnings.
Michael, research has always been a passion of me, and I've done many surveys. So my latest one that we launched in May was called A Road with No End. And I don't know about you, but when I think back to when I graduated from college, I said, hurrah, I don't have to go back to school. And how 100% wrong I was. I have consistently learned ever since that day, and I guess I'll be learning until the day I die. So, as I said, my latest research work was conducted in May, and we surveyed our database, which is about 10,000 contacts, and asked them 30 questions. And out of that, we got 990 responses, and that exceeded our initial expectations.
It's a fantastic response.
Yeah, that number of respondents give us a very clear picture of where bookkeepers and accountants are in the world of digital learning. And if we look at the metrics first, that response rate of 990 has a confidence level of 99% and a margin of error of 4%. The respondents represented a cross-section of the population with representation across Canada and into one of the territories, all the major cities. And we filtered the data because we could do that, and we looked at the comparisons of how bookkeepers in public practice rated the questions and how bookkeepers in industry, government, and not-for-profits did. And surprisingly, there weren't many differences. However, when we did that same filter on age, because we asked age groups, there were a number of differences, not surprisingly, from those under the age of 45. And let me focus here for just a moment on the demographics. The median range was 45 to 54. Slightly more respondents from business and industry than from public practice, and they made up just over 60% of the respondents. Respondents were almost equally divided between female and male. But what's interesting, when you filter that same question for those under 45, now the number drops to 30% male, 65% female, and 5 chose not to account. And that has some significance because if you go to the stats from StatsCan, the population of accountants is almost split as of their survey last year.
Wow. So what's your big takeaway from all of that?
Well, I summarized it as follows, and that is that the overall results of the survey show that bookkeepers and accountants are not rushing to embrace the digital world of learning, except in the area of webinars, which now surprisingly are a stepstone from classroom to digital learning. CPA Canada did a survey in 2012 and asked the same question, and the results were 180% in variance from what I discovered. In other words, in 2012, there was a high percentage that wanted what we call bumps and seats learning.
As you were speaking, I'm actually thinking at how powerful that is from the perspective of both the learner and our listeners, and as well the people that are bringing them information. And I actually started thinking about how, with our own community, how we can better serve them. So I was actually consuming your information as you were actually giving it, thinking, wow, there's so many pieces of information that could be delivered. And the fact that more and more people are finding it more valuable is both valuable for them and for the people bringing them the information.
Now, you've touched on two populations, the provider and the receiver. There's a couple of other worlds that are involved now.
Interesting.
You've touched on how will you structure your professional development in the 21st century, but the governing bodies like IPBC and CPA Canada have got to balance this to make sure that the learning is delivered efficiently and the standards are maintained.
Yeah, it's absolutely, because in a classroom, you have a bunch of things that exist to ensure it goes a certain way, whereas online, there's a lot of gap, there's a lot of gray area. So what's your thinking around the challenges they're faced with?
Well, there's some very easy ways of confirming that people are awake and not doing email. One is when I do my mini webinars through my Excel Magic every month, I get a report that shows me the percentage of people that maintain interest and so on. And certainly in our public webinars that we do, we include what are called polling questions. So roughly every 10 minutes, there's a multiple choice question. And it's basically to test if you're still looking in, because the questions, there's no score on it. But if you miss more than 25% of the polling questions, you don't get your CPD.
Interesting. Very, very good. And that's from the perspective of the person delivering, ensuring that content's been consumed. And then from a listener's perspective or a consumer of that information, I guess their desire and demand would be that the education helps them move forward, gives them, because if it's not engaging, if it's not interesting, but yet they need to sit through it, they're going to want better information, maybe more consumable or entertaining or interesting. And so I think what's neat about it is that it puts pressure on both. I mean, there's lots of benefits to it, but as well, it puts pressure on the person that's consuming that education to actually consume it in a new way. But there's lots of benefits that go along with that. But as well, from the people producing that education for people, the onus is on them to make sure that it's good, it's engaging, that it fits with the way people are learning online. Otherwise, people will disengage and nobody's going to win out of it, right?
Right. And two more factors, and again, this is something we were just adding this year, is a test at the end. And the second thing where there's a huge payback is, let's take the Excel mini webinars that I do called Excel Magic every month. The week after we've done the live event, we provide every registrant with a recording of the webinar, my notes for the webinar, and my teaching files for the webinar, so they can go back their heart's content, and if I did it too fast or there was confusion there, they've got 3 types of resources to enable them to make sure they get it.
That's fantastic. And I think that leads to that engagement, is that, again, there's different learning styles. Some people perhaps miss something. They can always go back and get what they need from your past content information, and they can do it on demand. They don't have to show up at a specific time.
You're absolutely right. So, Michael, what I was going to say is perhaps we should now focus on some of the key takeaways from the survey.
Yeah, let's dig into it.
All right. First of all, a high percentage have the IPBC CPB or a CPA. And that's not surprising because that's who we targeted. And consequently, a high percentage of them require CPDs. And here's a follow-up on the point that I was going to make. We asked them to rank how they preferred to get their CPD credits, and we gave them 4 choices: webinars, classroom, conferences, and reading. So their first choice was webinars, 41%, followed by classroom, 26%, conferences, 25%, and readings, and so on.
When they opted into that, was that a one or nothing, or could they choose multiple?
We actually asked them for their first 4 choices.
Got it.
And it doesn't change much as you go across.
Interesting. Yeah. So I'm actually I'm fascinated that conferences would be so low, because it's kind of an immersed learning opportunity for people from a time perspective, though it could be too great.
Yep.
Interesting.
All right. So now let's dive into this issue. We ask questions like, do you read paper newspapers, digital newspapers, paper magazines, and digital magazines? And I will share with you the survey respondents' reading habits. Let's focus first on paper newspapers. The jury was out there. They were split 49% on read paper and 51% don't. And interesting, the number one paper that came across, not surprisingly, was the Globe and Mail and their community newspaper. Now, when we go to digital newspapers, 52% are now reading them online. If we go to paper magazines, 56% still like flipping the pages. But now when we go to digital magazines, only 30% have found that to be a useful source.
It's interesting. Well, I like it's fascinating the fact that people are consuming a good chunk of local community newspapers. Now, mind you, a lot of them are moving to digital versions of that. But then when it comes to magazines, they're not necessarily consuming digital magazines.
That's right.
Wow. I think the audience would be very interested to know how they can shape their behaviors, I guess, on this information. But as well, it's fascinating more so for me listening to that, just in terms of how a community is actually consuming information. It's fascinating.
Okay, so now, Michael, if we move on to what I call groups, these would be Facebook groups like yours, these would be LinkedIn groups. There's some interesting information here. Now, understand that we did not ask the question, do you have a LinkedIn profile? Because if we had, probably 90% of the respondents. We focused on, do they belong to any groups? Only 26% of the respondents belong to LinkedIn groups. And if we go to Facebook, the number's almost the same. Now, everybody has a Facebook profile, but in terms of groups like yours, only 24%. And that's interesting because if you look on the other side of the coin and you look at marketing gurus, they're all saying, social media is the way to go. But that survey certainly does not prove that statement.
Yeah, it'll be what I'm really curious to see is what this would look like in a year from now, and as we move through. There's so many changes happening in the way people are consuming and participating in these networks. I think there's going to be changes happening all the time, and it's like groups today could be something else tomorrow. So I think what's nice about this is you created a benchmark that will be very interesting to be refreshing and looking at how are things changing moving forward. But that is a shocking number that, of the people that did the survey, I would say that a very high percentage, like you say, would either be LinkedIn or a Facebook user, but yet only 26% of them are actually leveraging groups. So it either means that there's going to be a lot of growth in groups, or this is not something that's valuable to the majority.
And speaking of baseline, you're absolutely right. We intend to do this on an annual basis. So this time next year, we'll have comparative data, which should really prove interesting.
Yeah, I think so.
And the same numbers or same reaction is when we ask a question about Twitter, and we ask the following: do you follow business people or technology people on Twitter? And the answer is 10% do, 90% don't.
That does not surprise me, because we've been working on our Twitter feed and we're getting information out on it, and for me personally, I've never been a big fan of Twitter and the way that it works and how it operates. And I think that it's very interesting to hear that it's sort of very powerful information. And the question, Al, it's like 10% do, 90% don't. There's millions of people on that platform. Why do you think this is?
Well, for me, I don't find the time to do it. And I know a great friend of mine, Jennifer Warwa, is the proverbial tweeter. I don't know where she finds the time to tweet as often as she do. I just don't have bandwidth in my day.
Yeah, I would agree. It is a lot of time. And I think if we looked at Jennifer, we'd probably see that that's her platform of choice and the one she uses and the one she gets value from, and that's it. And then if we looked at your behaviors, you've got your choices of how you spend your time in the day, and it's not Twitter.
And speaking of that, when we asked the questions on Facebook and LinkedIn, we also asked them who they followed. And in retrospect, that was a dumb question, because guess how many different responses we got?
A lot.
990.
Wow.
Because everybody has their own, particular, that thing that they want to follow.
Yeah.
Now, you're not going to like the numbers from the next one. We asked, do you listen to technology and or business podcasts? What do you think the response was?
I'd say it's extremely low.
And you're absolutely right, 21.4%.
Yeah. It's not surprising. That one's not surprising. If you asked me that before we started the Successful Bookkeeper podcast, I would have thought that it would be a lot higher. But I think it's an interesting, where podcasts are at, I think it's an interesting point in the technology where people are just starting to wake up to that this even exists, because podcasts have been around for a very long time. However, the ability to consume them has not always been that favorable. And right now, it's incredibly easy to consume podcasts, but yet I think the user interface on Apple for listening to podcasts is very clunky. It's very difficult and confusing. And I'm not sure about Android, but for myself with iTunes, I'm not surprised. It takes time. You have to actually go in and figure out the user interface. And I've had lots of bookkeepers that are listening, asking questions, like even to leave a review is complicated to leave a review. And that's how other people find out about things. So I think it's going to be interesting, like the groups. I'd love to see where that number is in 12 months. And we're definitely going to have an anniversary show when you have that one out, because is it growing? I love podcasts, and one of the reasons why I started it for the Successful Bookkeeper is that I found out about it not that long ago, maybe 12 months to 18 months ago. I started going, well, I always knew podcasts existed, but I started listening to some of these shows, and they were so valuable that it became a part of my behavior. So whenever I'm in the car, I'm not listening to news or music or anything like that. I'm either listening to a book and podcasts, and most of the time now it's podcasts. So whether that's going to change in this community for bookkeepers greatly, we don't know. We're going to find out, but that's really interesting.
And I would agree with you on a personal nature. Because of my physical condition, Michael, I go to bed early. I'm in bed at 8 o'clock. And when I'm in bed, I do one of two things. I have a wonderful device called a Microsoft Surface that lives in bed 24 hours a day with me, which means because of its lightness, I can do a little bit of work at night. But my preference now is that I'm 4 or 5 times a week in the evening, I'm listening to recorded podcasts, particularly yours.
Oh, thank you, Alan. That's great. But sorry, I had a little bit of head swelling there. But I think that's going to be interesting and I'm actually going to ask that question of some of our listeners, is where are they listening to it? Like, you're listening to it in bed. This is part of your behavior now, to listen to podcasts, and the Successful Bookkeepers being one of them. I'm curious though, what else are you listening to?
Oh, some very involved technology ones that take it to a high level, like the new Microsoft update for Windows 10, for example. I'm in the midst of that. and then the future of accounting programs, some very technical Excel stuff.
Beautiful. I think that's very revealing. You're very interested in technology, and not just on the surface, very deep technology. And for most people, that content would just be way over their heads. But for you, you're a part of a very, I'm not going to say small group because it could be a massive group, but there's a very defined group of people who want that level of information. And you can find it through these podcasts, which is amazing, really. And so I think that once people start waking up to the power of podcasts, because there's so many of them, and they're, you find what you like, and it's free, and you can get to the level of information that you really want, and you can flip and choose what it is. I mean, if the people you're listening to right now stop producing valuable content, you'd find somebody else to listen to. So again, I think it's going to be really interesting to see where these numbers go.
I agree, Michael. And the beauty of it is that you've identified my likes in podcasts, but every single one of your listeners has the ability to create a learning platform or schedule that meets their particular needs.
Yeah, that's what's so exciting about it. Absolutely. And so let's continue on with the survey and some of your other findings.
Yeah, I don't want to bury all your listeners in numbers, but here's 3 more that are interesting. We asked the question, do you read technology/business blogs? Now here, the number goes significantly higher because the response there was 36%. And then the one that really surprised me out of the whole survey questions, do you watch YouTube videos? And what do you think the response was, Michael?
Well, this one, I am on the edge of my seat.
53.1%.
Wow.
I'm going wow the other way.
Wow.
I thought it would be significantly higher than that.
Really? I think even based on the numbers you've put out, right? Blogs, podcast, YouTube, I'm actually I'm intrigued by that. That's very interesting because I consider that to be, I mean, what's the highest number of all of the survey questions around how they're consuming digital content? Is YouTube the highest?
Yep.
Wow. Just thinking about what we're doing and how we're producing content and the different things that we're doing. I mean, we don't do that much on YouTube. If anything, I mean, we post these podcasts on YouTube, but we're not producing videos per se. So it's something to look at. That's what the listener 52% are looking for.
That's correct.
Now, is it they're looking for it, or is that what they've sort of, because YouTube's been around for a while, there's a lot of behaviors already established around that platform. And I mean, Google's done a great job of having it embedded everywhere, but that's the way they're consuming it right now. Whether or not it's the way they want it or not, it is how they're consuming it, which is very interesting.
Right. And that's the last number I want to throw at you. I'd like to sum up.
Yes, please do.
A real summary of the findings. And it goes like this, Michael. The big picture clearly shows that bookkeepers and accountants are slowly moving to embrace the digital world of learning, starting with webinars. The reversal of their preference for in-person seminars in just 5 years represents significant shifts in the professional development paradigm. Further, millennials appear to be abandoning the world of print in favor of video delivered through online platforms such as YouTube's.
Wow. I sum it up with this. It was how you started the conversation was about lifelong learning. And I think for me, Alan, it's been interesting just to know these numbers and to see how things are changing. But as well, it's inspiring to those that are lifetime learners. And I think the people that would listen to a podcast like this are people who are committed to expanding their profession, becoming better at what they do, and growing their business. And they're committed to moving forward, which education is a piece of that. And the exciting thing is that there's so never in our history has there been such access to information and content and the ability to educate yourself from anywhere, anytime on the planet.
Right. And what just to add a wrap to this, When I do my fifth and last keynote at the IPBC Ignite conference, the focus is going to be on a lifetime of learning. And I've got some amazing flashbacks to show and some forecasts of where it'll be going in the future.
Beautiful. Well, that is exciting. And if for those of you who have not yet purchased your ticket to the IPBC conference this year in late September, early October, I believe, get on it. It's going to be fantastic. And as Alan has already mentioned, that is a sample of what is there. It's what's latest and greatest, what's happening, where are the trends, where are things growing. And you're going to meet a lot of amazing, wonderful people there as well. People like you, people that want to grow their business, people that are committed to being great bookkeepers. And you can say hi to Alan and say you heard him on the Successful Bookkeeper podcast if you haven't met him yet. Well, Alan, this has been really interesting, and I think for the listener, there's a lot of changes happening in education and changes happening all over the place with technology. But this gives an insight as to where the crowd is moving and what people are doing. And so thank you for being and taking the time to share this with us.
You're most welcome. It's been a pleasure, Michael.
Absolutely. Now, where can they, if they want to get more information, Alan, on this specifically or to get in touch with you, what's the best way to do that?
Well, the starting point is my short email address, which is Alan, A-L-A-N, at K2E.ca. And I think you know, Michael, that my other passion is Excel. And the listeners should know that every month I run 2 what I call Excel Magic mini webinars. It's 30 minutes. It's at lunchtime, Eastern Daylight Time, and it's free. And if you're interested, you go to our website, which is www.k2e.ca, click on the Learning tab, and click on Excel Magic Webinar Series. And that'll take you to the next 3, which are coming up week after next, next week, and then 2 in July.
Excellent. And we'll have a direct link right to that page. If you're listening right now, just go into the show notes, click on that link. It'll take you right in and you can find your way. And thank you, Alan. This has been great. And again, we'll have you back, I'm sure, for a bunch of other topics, but for sure, when this survey gets done again, this will be interesting to look back on.
Great.
Alan, thank you for being on the podcast. That wraps another episode of the Successful Bookkeeper podcast. To learn more about today's guest and to get access to all sorts of valuable free business building resources, you can go to thesuccessfulbookkeeper.com. Until next time, goodbye.
You've been listening to The Successful Bookkeeper with Michael Palmer. For more information and to download the resources mentioned in this episode, please visit us at thesuccessfulbookkeeper.com. Thank you for listening.